Okay, this story for this week is Tanizaki Jun'ichiro's Aozukashi no hanashi, or translated into English as Mr. Bluemound, published in 1926, so year 2 of the Shōwa period. Okay, Tanizaki Jun'ichirō, we've already read one of his stories, Heisei, the tattooer, which is his debut story, and the themes that appear in that work are kind of repeated and re-expressed throughout his works, and we see some of those original themes he talks about in Heisei in this work as well. Okay, so let's jump right into it. This is one of the weirdest stories that we will read this semester. Okay, but it's a perennial hit with my students, both foreign and Japanese students. Okay, so I have 3 quotes at the beginning of your study guide that sort of lead you into some of the themes that are addressed in the story. So I'll read that. The first is from Ludwig Feuerbach in his preface to the 1843 edition of The Essence of Christianity. Our modern era, he writes, prefers the image to the thing, the copy to the original, the representation to the reality, appearance to being. Okay? So he's specifically alluding to Plato there, right? And he's basically saying that in the pre-modern period, or in classical antiquity, humans were more oriented toward the ultimate reality behind the appearance of things, right? But in modernity, according to Feuerbach, we see a reversal of this. We see an obsession with appearances rather than the reality behind the appearances. Okay, the second quote is from Susan Sontag, the American essayist and fiction writer. I think she wrote fiction and philosopher. From her famous book on photography, she writes, and this Tanizaki story, of course, is about film. It's about images. It's about photography. It's about ultimately the difference between the representation of the thing and the thing itself, and then the ultimate Platonic form that is supposedly behind the thing itself. Okay, her quote: "The powers of photography have, in effect, de-Platonized our understanding of reality, making it less and less plausible to reflect upon our experiences according to the distinction between images and things, between copies and originals. It suited Plato's derogatory attitude toward images to liken them to shadows." Shadows, of course, is very important in Tanizaki's works, this one included, so underline that word, shadows. "Transitory, minimally informative, immaterial, impotent co-presences of the real things which cast them. But the force of photographic images comes from their being material realities in their own right, richly informative deposits left in the wake of whatever emitted them, potent means for turning the tables on reality, for turning it into a shadow." Okay, so here, again, she's doing what Feuerbach says occurs in modernity. She's inversing or inverting this relation between the thing itself and its shadow, between the thing itself and its image. Okay, so reality is turned into a shadow through photography, Sontag argues. "Images are more real than anyone could have supposed." Okay, that last sentence especially reads as if it were taken straight from Tanizaki's story. Okay, so Tanizaki is kind of making the same point in his work back in 1926, that images are more real than anyone could have supposed. And the last quote is from Slavoj Žižek, from his bestseller, I don't know if it's a bestseller, his hit work, The Pervert's Guide to the Cinema, which was also made into a little documentary you could probably find on YouTube. "Cinema," Zizek writes, "is the ultimate pervert's art. It doesn't give you what you desire, it tells you how to desire." Okay, so we see that mechanism exactly in this work by Tanizaki, right? We have film, and specifically the films of the main character, showing the other main character how to desire, what to desire, and so forth. Okay. So terms you need to know in order to understand this story. Well, there's basically just one. The idea of Plato's idea or theory of forms. Okay. What is the theory of forms according to Plato? It's the idea that behind the flux of phenomenal appearances lies an immutable realm of non-material abstract forms or ideas that possess the highest and most fundamental kind of reality. Okay? The form or idea is an aspatial, atemporal, objective blueprint of perfection, as contrasted with the icon. Icon is just the Greek word for image, right? Which is merely the form's particular aspect, which exists materially and temporally. According to this theory, each concrete particular is an imitation of its abstract or eternal form. Okay? So I'm sitting here in front of a bench. Right here's the bench behind me. This is a particular bench, so it's the icon of the original bench. And what is the original bench? The original bench exists in the realm of forms. It's abstract, perfection, the perfect bench. Okay, so there's a perfect bench on top, which is the most real. Then there's the particular bench that's in front of me, which is the icon of the original bench. And then there's a third bench, which is the bench depicted by the artists. So the third bench depicted by the artist is the furthest removed from reality, which is the formal bench that exists in the realm of forms. Okay, so know a little bit about that. There's all kinds of materials online and books about Plato's theory of the forms. But Tanizaki was reading a lot of Plato, I think, in the 1920s, and you see this idea of Plato's theory of forms appear in many of his works of the period. Probably most conspicuously in this work. Okay. Now, let us jump into the questions on your study guide. There are, 14 in all. I will walk you through this. On your study guide it says answer any 6 of the following, but answer all of them, as always. Okay. Number 1. Number 1, describe the narrative structure of this story. Okay. I forget the details. It's been a year since I've read it, so I don't want to say too much, or I can't say too much actually. But I think it takes the form of a letter, right? Somebody's writing a letter to someone else, right? Yeah. So explain this structure. Is it a frame story? Does it consist of epistles, or is it an epistolic, I think, structure? Is it a novel that's built on letters from who to whom? Okay, so explain the narrative structure. Number 2, perversion and voyeurism are at the heart of this work. How might this story be cited as evidence for Zizek's claim, quoted above, that film is the ultimate pervert's art, in the sense that it doesn't give you what you desire, it tells you how to desire? In other words, how is this monstrosity called Aozukashi, Mr. Bluemound, to some extent the creation of Mr. Nakada? Okay? So without Mr. Nakada, without the kantoku, the eiga kantoku, the film director Nakada and his films, there would be no Bluemound, right? So Bluemound is the product of this contemporary film culture, specifically the films of Nakada. Number 3, explain Aozukashi's, Mr. Bluemound's, theory about originals and copies, forms and shadows and so forth, right? Which is informed by Plato, as I mentioned. So explain this theory, and explain how the theory relates to his obsession with Yurako. Yurako, of course, is the director's wife, who he marries, and who stars in all of his films, right? So how does his sort of Platonic ideas relate to his obsession with Yurako? In his view, this is the important part of the question, in his view, what is most primary or real? Okay, so where is the real Yurako? Is the real Yurako some idea that exists eternally in some realm of abstract forms? Is the real Yurako the actual physical Yurako that is at the director's home at night? Or is the Yurako the one that appears on the silver screen in the films? Okay, so which is most real according to Mr. Bluemound? Number 4. Yurako is described in various ways throughout the story, but the real Yurako is never fully known or revealed. List and describe each of these representations of Yura. Okay, so I just mentioned 3 of them. What does Tanizaki seem to be suggesting by never revealing to us the real Yurako? Okay, So he gives us 3 representations or presentations or manifestations of Yurako, but it seems that none of them are the real one. Where is the real one? Is there a real one at all? What is Tanizaki's philosophical point on this issue? Number 5, the relation between Mr. Bluemound and his blow-up doll, or blow-up dolls, I should say, because he has several, I think, seems to parallel or mirror, in a rather grotesque way, the relationship between Mr. Nakada and Yurako. Discuss this analogical structure. Okay, so Mr. Bluemound is to his blow-up doll, as Nakada, the director, is to Yurako. Okay, in what ways do these 2 couples or pairs parallel one another? Discuss this analogic structure. Number 6. At the end of his letter, and that's right, yeah, the work is basically in letter form. It's a letter from Nakada to Aozukashi, right? At the end of his letter, Mr. Nakada states that he is no longer capable of loving Yurako, and that he is resigned to die. What was it about his encounter with Mr. Bluemound that was so radically transformative and that ultimately leads to his death, right? So he meets Mr. Bluemound. He discovers through his conversation with Mr. Bluemound that Mr. Bluemound, in fact, who has never met his wife in real person, actually knows more about his wife than he does, right? And this leads to his decision to die, his resignation to die. Okay, what was it about his encounter with Mr. Bluemound that radically transformed Mr. Nakada? Number 7, list and describe all the grotesque elements of this work, and there are many, especially at the end, right? And in the original, when it first appeared in Japanese in 1926, I think a lot of the lines from the work were blotted out in fuseji. It's called fuseji, which is when the censors come in and blot out with big black pen or whatever they're using certain passages that were considered controversial or outrageous or grotesque or overly erotic and so forth. And I think a lot of the lines from this work were censored. Okay, so there are a lot of grotesque elements in this work. What do you think Tanizaki was trying to convey by making the work so outrageously grotesque? Number 8. It is well known that, and I mentioned this in the study guide for Shisei, the tattooer, it is well known that Tanizaki was throughout his life a committed foot fetishist. Identify the descriptions of feet in this work. And there are many. Why do you think Tanizaki's characters are so often attracted to the feet of beautiful young females? Okay, and foot fetishism and masochism in Tanizaki are often very related. So consider this in the general framework of male masochism. Number 9. Describe the transformation that occurs in Mr. Bluemound, or at least in Mr. Nakada's perception of him throughout the story. Okay. So at first, for example, Mr. Bluemound appears to be a rather young and elegant and sophisticated gentleman, but as the night proceeds, his sort of true self or true nature comes out the more he drinks. Okay, so discuss this transformation in perception of Mr. Bluemound. Number 10. Number 10, what do you think Mr. Nakada's motives were in explaining this episode to his wife? Okay. So Mr. Nakada, the film director, has this weird encounter with Bluemound, and he didn't have to tell his wife about it, but he chooses to do so. Why does he do so? And couldn't he have just died without telling her about this terrible episode? Number 11. Do you detect any Buddhist elements or themes or overtones in the work? Explain. Okay. Number 12. Mr. Nakada could have gotten up and walked away at any moment from the creepy Mr. Bluemound, at any moment in the conversation. What motivates him to stay? Okay, so he's having this terrible experience with Bluemound, learning all these things about his wife, or about what Mr. Bluemound knows about his wife. Why doesn't he just walk away? Why does he stay through the whole thing and eventually invite him home with him? Or go home with him, rather. Number 13. Although not described in the story, what do you think Yurako's reaction to the letter was? Explain. Okay? So as always, we don't have direct access to Yurako, to her thoughts, to her reactions. I think I had a student several years ago rewrite this story from the perspective of Yurako as her graduation thesis, right? So how do you think Yurako, who we only know indirectly, how do you think she react to this letter and to the story, to the encounter with Mr. Bluemound? Number 14, the final question. What do you think Tanizaki is trying to convey about film, photographs, sexual desire in the modern world, women and their representations, the male gaze, appearance versus reality, etc.? Okay, these are just some of the themes that appear. There are many. You could probably add to this list. What is he trying to convey about these themes by writing this story? Okay, what is his message or point in writing it? Is there a point? Is it didactic in some way?